The Miami sun was brutal that afternoon. 92 degrees. Humidity crushing the circuit. But the real heat wasn't coming from the asphalt. It was coming from 20 drivers who had reached the breaking point. By lap 47, the radio frequency had become something the FIA had never encountered before. Not anger. Not complaints. Organization. Coordinated, documented, surgical dissent. One driver after another, British, Dutch, Monegasque, Spanish, they weren't venting anymore. They were testifying. And every word was being recorded, time-stamped, preserved forever in telemetry data that couldn't be edited or rewritten. The question nobody could answer yet was simple but catastrophic. Had the stewards just destroyed the credibility of the entire penalty system? It started with a decision made that morning in the stewards' room. A track limits violation. 1/10 of a second gained on the apex of turn 12. On paper, it was straightforward. The rulebook was clear. The penalty was applied. 5-second time penalty, delivered over the radio with the clinical precision the FIA had practiced for decades. Standard procedure. Textbook enforcement. But that wasn't what sparked the mutiny. What sparked it was the precedent sitting in the data from 2 weeks prior. The same maneuver. The exact same line through the same corner. The same 1/10 of a second gained. Different driver. Different race. Different outcome. No penalty. No investigation. No radio message from the stewards. Just silence. Just acceptance. The moment a second driver realized this, truly realized it, they did something unprecedented in modern Formula One. They checked the data themselves. They compared lap times. They pulled footage. And within minutes, word had spread through the paddock like electricity through a circuit. The drivers had discovered something the stewards hadn't bothered to check, a pattern of selective enforcement so glaring that it couldn't be explained away with regulatory language or steward discretion. This wasn't one bad call. This was a system failing under its own contradictions. But that wasn't the real problem either. The real problem was that everyone in the FIA knew exactly what had just happened, and they had no strategy for it. For 30 years, the regulatory body had operated on an assumption that had never been tested, that drivers would accept steward decisions without evidence, without cross-reference, without demanding consistency. The drivers had been trained to complain privately, to vent in team meetings, to move on. That was the unwritten contract between the grid and the FIA. Accept the decision. Voice your frustration behind closed doors. Never challenge the system publicly while the race was still happening. Miami broke that contract. The first driver to speak over the radio did so with surgical precision. He didn't yell. He didn't protest emotionally. He asked a question. A simple one. Can we get clarification on how this differs from the decision made at the previous race? The tone in his voice, controlled, professional, lethal, indicated he already knew the answer. He was forcing the stewards to either explain themselves or admit they'd been inconsistent. The steward's response came through moments later. Generic. Bureaucratic. It explained the rulebook without addressing the contradiction. That's when the second driver jumped on the radio. Then a third. Within 90 seconds, 4 drivers had asked variations of the same question. The stewards had no response that didn't expose the flaw in their logic. What happened next changed everything about how Formula One would function going forward. One of the larger teams, an outfit with resources and data infrastructure most competitors couldn't match, began real-time analysis. Engineers cross-referenced every single track limits decision from the entire season. Every penalty. Every non-penalty. Every gray area decision. They compiled it. And then they did something that would haunt the FIA for months. They distributed it to every other team on the grid via encrypted communication. Within 3 laps, every engineer, every strategist, every team principal in the paddock had proof that the stewards had been enforcing the same rule differently depending on which driver was behind the wheel. The data was irrefutable. The pattern was unmistakable. And the implications were nuclear. A team principal, one of the most respected voices in Formula One, made a decision that would echo through the sport. He authorized his driver to speak. Not in anger. In evidence. Over the radio, live on broadcast, the driver began citing specific examples. Turn 12, lap 19, race 3. Turn 12, Lap 42, Race 7. Same corner. Same violation. Different consequences. He was building a case in real time, using the most public platform available. The FIA'S race control scrambled. Multiple messages came through the radio, telling the driver to cease communication about the matter. The driver ignored them. He was protected by something the stewards hadn't considered. He wasn't being disrespectful or insubordinate. He was simply asking for consistency. He was asking for fairness. He was doing so with documentation that proved his point. What were they going to penalize him for? Wanting the system to work? That's where things got dangerous. Because the stewards realized, in that moment, that they had lost control of the narrative. The drivers weren't complaining about a single decision anymore. They were indicting the entire system. And they were doing it with such precision, such documentation, such public evidence that any response from the FIA would either validate their claims or look like suppression. The pressure in the paddock became suffocating. You could see it in the garage reactions. Engineers exchanging looks. Team principals pacing. Radio messages becoming shorter, more tense. One driver's engineer, speaking to his driver, said something that would later be replayed in clips across social media. They're not going to answer. They can't answer. The data doesn't support any other decision. The resignation in that voice, the understanding that the regulatory body had fundamentally failed, was the sound of trust breaking in real time. By lap 60, the atmosphere had shifted from anger to something far more dangerous, resignation mixed with cold clarity. The drivers had moved past the emotional stage. They were now operating from a place of documented evidence and system-level understanding. They understood that the FIA couldn't admit to inconsistency without triggering investigations into previous seasons. They understood that this wasn't about one penalty anymore. It was about whether the entire championship had been administered fairly. A mechanic in one garage, speaking off the record later, described the moment perfectly. When you realize the referee has been making up the rules as they go, you stop playing the game the same way. You start documenting everything. You start protecting yourself. And everyone around you starts doing the same thing. That's when a sport stops being about winning and starts being about survival. What happened in the hours after the race was equally revealing. The FIA released a statement that acknowledged the decision was correct according to the rulebook. But they didn't address the inconsistency. They didn't explain why the same rule had been applied differently in previous races. They simply restated that the penalty had been applied correctly. It was a non-answer wrapped in regulatory language, and every driver in the paddock understood exactly what it meant. The FIA had no defense for the pattern. They were choosing to ignore it. But ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. Because by then, every major media outlet had picked up the story. The data was public. The analysis was simple enough that casual fans could understand it. The narrative had escaped the paddock and entered the broader conversation about whether Formula One was being administered fairly at the highest levels. And once that question entered the public consciousness, there was no taking it back. The technical reality beneath all of this was actually quite simple, but the implications were staggering. Formula One's penalty system was built on steward discretion. The rulebook provided guidelines, but the stewards had the authority to interpret violations based on context. Intent mattered. Severity mattered. Impact mattered. This had been the system for decades, and it had generally worked because drivers trusted that the stewards were exercising that discretion consistently. But consistency requires documentation. It requires precedent to be checked. It requires the stewards to actually remember what they decided in previous races. And that's where the system had failed. Because stewards changed from race to race. Different people. Different interpretations. Different standards. The drivers had finally noticed the pattern because they now had the data tools to track it. What made this particularly dangerous was the psychological impact on the drivers themselves. A driver has to believe in the fairness of the system to push themselves to the absolute limit. If they believe the stewards might penalize them arbitrarily, they drive defensively. They make conservative decisions. They protect themselves rather than pursuing victory. The entire sport becomes cautious and political rather than aggressive and pure. And that's exactly what started happening immediately after Miami. In the weeks that followed, drivers began making different choices. They avoided corners where they might be accused of track limits violations, even when the racing line was technically legal. They left space they didn't need to leave. They made passes in different locations because they didn't trust that certain moves would be adjudicated fairly. The stewards had inadvertently changed the way the sport was raced, not through new rules, but through the loss of credibility. One driver, speaking to his engineer during a practice session 2 races later, put it bluntly, "If I can't trust that the rules will be applied fairly, I have to assume I'll be penalized. So I'm not pushing the limit. I'm staying well inside it." That single radio message, heard only by his team, represented a fundamental breakdown in the relationship between the competitor and the regulatory body. The FIA's challenge now wasn't just about defending one penalty. It was about rebuilding trust in a system that had been exposed as fundamentally inconsistent. They would have to do something unprecedented, retroactively address the pattern. Review past decisions. Explain why inconsistency had occurred. And most critically, implement a system that prevented it from happening again. But here's what nobody in the FIA seemed to understand. You can't rebuild trust through policy changes. Trust is rebuilt through transparency and accountability. The drivers had demanded both. And the FIA's response, to defend the system rather than acknowledge the flaw, had only deepened the credibility crisis. As the season progressed, the ripple effects became visible in ways that went far beyond the racetrack. Team principals began hiring data analysts specifically to track steward decisions. Lawyers started attending races to document penalty precedents. Drivers began requesting written explanations of penalty decisions in real time rather than accepting the standard radio notification. The entire ecosystem of Formula One had shifted into a defensive, documentation-obsessed mode. What started as a single penalty at Miami had exposed something far more fundamental. The regulatory system of Formula One had been operating on trust alone. And once that trust was broken, once the drivers had proof of inconsistency, the entire system had to be rebuilt. The question that remained hanging over the sport wasn't whether the FIA would change the penalty system. The question was whether they could change it fast enough before the drivers' loss of confidence infected the entire competitive integrity of the championship. Because in a sport where milliseconds separate victory from defeat, where split-second decisions define careers, the belief that the rules will be applied fairly isn't just important. It's everything. And in Miami, the drivers had made it clear that belief was gone. What the FIA did next would determine whether they could ever get it back.